researching this talk, you always try to find new points and new things to present. And I ran across this, the Universal Ethical Code for Scientists. And I got to thinking about it, and these are just some general principles that all scientists should abide by, not just geoscientists or engineers. And it's Sir David King, government chief scientific advisor and head of the Government Office for Science, the Royal Academy of Engineering in the UK. Well, it doesn't just stay over in Europe, it applies across the board here. And some of the points he wants to make are listed here. You need to foster ethical research. And we've had this question for years and years and years and years and years. I mean, it goes back, one of the earliest ones that I remember before my time, but was some of the ethical research on the prisoners from the Japanese.
And fundamental laws of geology came here from England, Scotland, so why not some ethics rules?
Ethics from them, so, yeah. So you need scientists, and I understand we're not researching here, but you are. You raise questions and you use scientific investigations and the scientific method in your work. We should always be aware of how that proper research, ethical research, impacts the work and impacts society that we're involved with. And we should support that communication amongst ourselves. You don't want to keep it, to yourself, but if you see somebody maybe behaving a little questionable, it's kind of your responsibility to rein them in, or at least raise the topic and say, hey, let's talk about it.
What about if you see someone going out of their way, even when it's inconvenient, to do the right thing? Isn't it just as important to point that out?
It's one of the points that we've brought up over the years. You praise where praise is due, and accept praise. Right? All right, the next one here. So there's four slides of this. Rigor, honesty, and integrity. Skill and care in all your scientific work. I mean, some of that stuff was brought up with that cold fusion a number of years back. Was his scientific method appropriate? Were his data appropriate? Did he fudge anything? Was it reproducible? If you know what I mean about cold fusion. And here again, take steps to prevent corrupt practices and misconduct, whether it's informing the people that are doing this, or informing, for want of a better term, the regulatory aspect, whether it's government, local, or regulatory boards. If the people that are doing professional misconduct are required to be registered, licensed, certified, yada, 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 and they're not doing right, I hate to say it, but they need to be dealt with to protect the society, the people that they're impacting.
Remember last year, one of our moral fundamentals, historical slides, we talked about respecting the interests of others, looking at other people as having ends in themselves and not just to be used for your own benefit. There it is right there, respect the rights and reputations of others.
Yeah. Okay, so respect for life, the law, and public good. I mean, that's pretty much fundamental. That's what licensing is about. That's what board supervision or affirmation or whatever you want to call it. The board is evaluating you for abiding by the law. All right, back here, responsible communication. So listen and inform. In other words, you need to be out there providing information too. You need to be mentoring. You need to be doing the continuing education, but not necessarily from the receiving side, but the providing side. And so many of our licensees and our cohorts and our peers never do anything. And it's really a shame, because there's so much information that's just wonderful data and wonderful stories that are just locked up and lost. So now we're going into your side.
You assume that they are speed readers, that was pretty fast.
You want me to go back?
Yeah, back up one, I got a comment on that, if you don't mind. I think another responsible communication would be scientists talking to scientists, because right now in our current world, we have a lot of people talking about science that are not scientists. So misinformation, the new word that you hear on a lot of the media channels, is now showing up, because you'll have a journalist supposedly talking to another journalist about science, and they're just taking whatever angle they want to take with it. So if you'd add the scientists communicating with scientists to come for the common good, I think that would help a lot of things, and I think that would go toward your ethical code as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know what? It also works for the media, but I'm sure that we have some issues with the ethical codes of the media people now.
I'm just thinking about science. Let's
Right.
let scientists
Right.
talk about science.
Right.
Yes, and you will see here shortly, we're gonna delve into that. This is not gonna be necessarily.
Down is,
Yeah, down is down and up is up. Necessarily going to be easy, but ethics is not supposed to be easy. The next series of slides is another one of those sections on fundamentals. Like we did last time, we looked at some historical, ethical schools of thought. Now we're going to do something a little bit different, focusing on environmental ethics. First, let's go through the basic definitions. I mean, what is ethics about? It's about understanding what your obligations are on how to act and how to refrain from acting, very basically said.
I
What should
think
be
that's
done,
come
what should
out
be
now in the
avoided.
Me Too generation, that side of it, how not to behave.
And then there are moral obligations. We saw last year in the historical review of ethical thoughts, a lot of it was about morals. So moral obligations, since ethics is about obligations for acting, the moral obligations depend on moral values. And what are moral values? Well, those are the quality that needs to be considered when you determine what you should do or not do. So where do these come from? We'll go through what people historically, people that have put a lot of thought to moral obligations, have said about this topic. The basic concepts of moral value, there's about 7 of them that we're going to go through. And for each one of them, we'll have a couple of references. This first one here, and this is a little bit stark and surprising. Egoism as a moral value, but it is. It is a moral value. And all of us at some point in time act according to egoism. How many have heard of the book called Atlas Shrugged that was sort of talked about quite a bit a few years back by Ayn Rand? So that is a book that talks about egoism. What is egoism? It's the thought, it's the moral concept that your own interests, your own preferences are what determines what anyone should do. When you're when deciding what you should do or what others should do, you should take your own desires and aims into consideration. This not only applies to your own actions, but others. Others should act in a way that is good for you. There's a 19th century already, there were books written about this kind of moral value concept. Then there's the cultural relativism nationalism. That's a big one. If you go down to the references here, we have some old German philosopher. We have a professor who just last year died, professor of history at Harvard, who wrote The Peopling of British North America, Bernard Bailyn. But you also have this fellow here. We've all heard of him. Well, he wrote a doctrine of fascism. That is one of the references for cultural relativism, which is a concept of moral value. That's the one that says that your cultures or your nation's interests and preferences are relevant for determining what anyone should do or should not do. When you're deciding what anyone should do, consider the aims, desires, and projects of your culture and your nation. This applies to other cultures as well. Not just your own culture, but other nations should act in a way that's good for your own nation. That's a school of thought. Then there's anthropocentrism. You can see how it's kind of stepping out. It starts with the person, yourself, then it's the nation or the culture, now it's people. Only interests and preferences of human beings are relevant for determining what anyone ought to do or avoid doing. When deciding what anyone should do, only consider the aims, desires, and projects of human beings. So this is compatible with doing something that maybe denies an individual person's interests, because it's better for humans in general. However, the interests of the individual should still be accounted for. So you should be aware that you're doing something that's not good for Bill, but it's good for people in general. But at least be aware that that's what's happening. And the references here, as a professor at Australian National University, who also died about 10 years ago, Man's Responsibility for Nature. Another famous author, Mortimer Adler, who died 10 years ago, chairman of the board of editors, 20 years ago, sorry, chairman of the board of editors of the Encyclopedia Britannica. He wrote The Difference of Man and the Difference It Makes. There's a lot of thought that has gone into moral values. It's not a trivial thing. It's not just, your mom telling you not to eat the cookie from the cookie jar. Although that's part of it too. All it is. Biocentrism. Now we've stepped out even more. And we see this in life, in politics, in decisions that society makes about what should and shouldn't be done, protecting species. Now we're worried in this concept of moral value, we're worried about the interests and preferences of living things, humans, animals, plants, lichens, bacteria. They're all relevant for determining what should or shouldn't be done. Plants and other living organisms have their own ends and interests. That's part of that school of thought. Their biological functionality. And these need to be considered when evaluating what's moral. This is obviously being applied in modern society. So who are the proponents of that? Of course, there's the famous Albert Schweitzer, right? He died when I was in elementary school. I remember that. He was Nobel Peace Prize winner. He wrote Reverence for Life, and then Kenneth Goodpaster, he's still alive, at the Harvard Business School on being morally considerable. So after biocentrism, the next step, what is left? How much further can you branch out and still be on Earth? Ecocentrism, the interests and preferences of an ecosystem, the whole system of organisms and their relationships. They're all relevant for determining what should or shouldn't be done. The biological functionality depends not only on the individual organisms, but the whole system where they thrive. And the relationships and sustainability of an ecosystem are needed for biological functionality. All right, there's that word already, we know it, sustainability. You see where the concepts that we deal with and wrestle with in some of the discussions that maybe you were referring to earlier, journalists throwing out various facts, sustainability. I mean, the kind of lively debate we're having in society goes back to this ecocentrism as a moral value. And who are some of the historical and important proponents of that? Aldo Leopold. Now, he died right after World War II, but he was a co-founder of the Wilderness Society. I don't know much about them. Do you? The Wilderness Society? A Sand County Almanac. I have heard of that book. Then J. Baird Caldecotte, he's still alive, distinguished research professor at the University of North Texas in defense of the land ethic. So it's all over. The world, people are thinking of moral values in a wide range of, narrow focus, just the individual. You notice that was some of the older 19th century stuff, and then there's a lot more of the current thought is in this biocentric and ecocentric.
And so when you think about it, these folks way back, they've been thinking about the bigger picture that we're now addressing as we realize how impactful mankind has been to the planet. Dwindling resources, blowing up the ecosystems, polluting. My gosh, those guys were real founders and forward thinkers for, if you want to call it Gaia principles or whatever, being Mother Earth.
Wilderness Society was founded in New York, and probably the most famous member was a guy named Bob Marshall.
Bob Marshall.
Yeah, that's,
I remember that.
yes.
Thank you.
So let me tell you a little bit about that.
Thank you. Yes, very good. There is one more that kind of sums them all up, and that is the pluralism, pragmatism, which just says that there's a variety of moral values. And obviously that happens because you get into this whole ecosystem thing, and now are you going to decide every time and every decision based on ecosystem? You're never going to make a decision that's really based on immediate, more maybe national or even egocentric individual person a basis? Probably not. It's going to be a mix, and that's what this school of thought says. There are a variety of moral values. None of them are more fundamental than the other. So the egocentric and the ecocentric, they're kind of on equal footing. Fundamentally, they're all relevant to moral evaluation. Self-interest, aesthetic interests, as well as natural values like sentience. What's sentience? That means beings that can have feelings, beings that have feelings. All right, so animals are typically thought of as being sentient because they may not be rational like we are, but they have feelings. So natural values such as having feelings, life, ecosystems, they all play a role in moral evaluation. So the level of focus, broad or narrow, just depends on the situation. Moral evaluation involves assessing trade-offs. Right, that's where you have the trade-offs between the individual's maybe immediate best interest and then the either countries or societies or mankind or the whole ecosystem's long-term interests. The trade-offs there is something that society does struggle with. And we'll see an example that we're all very familiar with here in a minute. And it's a whole list of people that are working on that. You notice on this one, 2 out of the 3 are still alive, and one of them just passed away last year, Judith Jarvis Thomson. She's pretty famous. She was the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Professor of Philosophy at MIT. She wrote Goodness and Advice. Thomas Nagel, still alive, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy and Law at New York University, The Fragmentation of Values. And very famous Martha Nussbaum, also still alive, Ernst Freund, Distinguished Professor of Law and Ethics at the University of Chicago. She wrote The Fragility of Goodness. You notice this term goodness shows up several times. What's ethical? What is it to be good? What's goodness? It makes common sense, and it's supposed to. All right, so let's just plunge right into one of the most lively debates we're having. We're in the environmental field, we're geologists. Climate change, can't avoid it. Can't pretend like it's not a topic. It's an ethics class, so let's go ahead and plunge in. Use that as an example. So when you do an evaluation of what's the ethical thing to do, well, first thing you got to collect some facts, but then where do you get the facts? What are the facts? Right? That's where the debate is. Facts that some journalists put forward, right? Just as an example, if I were to come in from another planet, I might say, I'm on planet Earth. Oh, NASA. Well, NASA has this global climate change site, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, just published this year, and they have a series of facts about Earth getting hotter. You can read it here yourself. The temperature change compared to baseline before 1900, CO2 levels going up, and some kind of a time range over which it has not been higher than it is today, the CO2 levels, and then some kind of a prediction at current levels, Earth's temperature will pass 1.5 degrees Celsius between 2025 and 2052. and it'll get even hotter later on. So those are now, are those facts? They're projections based on numbers that someone generated. So if you start with these as your facts, then you come up with consequences. The consequences of a 2-degree centigrade temperature rise. A certain percentage of the world's population will be exposed to heat waves every 5 years, and average sea level will rise by 3 feet by 2050 and up to 8 feet by 2099. So this is the kind of process that people do go through, and then people debate about what are the facts and what is a scientifically founded projection. But that's part of ethics, is doing this and doing it correctly, and then having a healthy debate about it. Go ahead.
Well, and the questions that we probably as scientists have to ask, where did the data come from? Where do we get temperature measurements or CO2 levels for the last 2 million years? Well, I know we've got ice cores. I don't know how many. And if you think about it, those ice cores are geographically limited.
How representative are
How
they?
representative are they? It's a geoscience aspect where we have to go into the past, and that's where it's being recorded. So are the media people understanding of the technologies and the processes of determining these quote-unquote facts? And is the general public educated enough to understand and ask intelligent questions about this, and make evaluations intelligently?
And then the media people often are also focused on sort of the exciting part, or the more dramatic part, which is the consequences. Go ahead.
Just 2 quick comments. Number one, on temperature, they did a study in Houston, and they looked at the temperature and they saw how it was going from the 70s, and they quickly calculated how much concrete had been poured since 70 to 2010, just 2010,
right,
and the temperature gradient on that. So there's a lot of, again, you're talking about stuff that is climate change, which there is climate change. It's very simple. Nobody can deny there's spring, summer, winter, and fall. But yet you ask someone how that occurs, they can't explain it to you. So I think you need to start with the basics there. So man has definitely affected by pouring concrete. And the second thing is there's a very good book written by C.E.P. Brooks in 1949. And he goes back through, most of the studies on the climate were done in the 20s by the Russians, by the Europeans and others. And you'll see a trend that starts happening in the 70s about and it's when the grants started happening. So there's definitely an effect. You can't deny that the climate is changing, but there's also a processing of the data that has been skewed, if you will.
Right, and so what we're trying to illustrate here is that you do have to start with facts. You're going to have to accept something as the best facts you have.
That's right.
And that's an important process. The main takeaway here is, without facts, it's hard to even do any kind of ethic evaluation or ethical decision making. It should be based on facts, and you do your best to have the most accurate facts on hand. Now, so how do people respond to the facts maybe that they're presented? There are doubts about facts. Now, doubts can be religious reasons, all right? Non-human factors will prevent consequences. It's Christian-based beliefs and Gaia hypothesis, which you just referred to, the Gaia approach. Earth has a self-regulating system that preserves life. So no matter what happens in terms of climate, in terms of temperature rise and sea level rise, the Earth will figure it out, so to speak. Then there's methodological doubts. For example, often criticism is computers modeling and simulations are not dependable. There's the old garbage in, garbage out. And of course there you have to, on the other hand, also be able to reconcile the fact that we do use computer models in just about everything from medicine to economics. So you can't just throw something out because it's a computer model. You have to be more specific than that. And then of course, since we started with our coming from another planet, we decided to go to the NASA website. The NASA website's conclusions based on their list of facts that we just looked at was, here's their quotes: scientific evidence for warming of the climate system is unequivocal. Another quote from the NASA website, taken as a whole, the range of published evidence indicates that the net damage costs of climate change are likely to be significant and increase over time. So there we have, now what do you do with this, all right? Now we come to the ethical decision making. So what does this all mean? What are we supposed to do? Well, in going through the process of deciding what is the right, what are the right steps that I should take, that society should take, that maybe the community of nations around the world should take? Well, the ethical approach is to go through those 7 or so moral values, concepts, and just kind of walk through them one by one. Look at it from a egocentric basis. What would be best for me as an individual, given these conclusions, all right, if I accept those facts? And then let me look at it from the national or cultural level. Let me look at it from the anthropological level and go through each one of those all the way out to the ecosystem level. And for each one of those, what is the best steps that should be taken in response to these conclusions that we came to from our facts? That's the basic process, and that's really what we wanted to illustrate today, walk you through a rather tough example, but very relevant example, and this is ethics at work.
Okay, so we've run into these problems. I've seen it as a regulator, and I'm sure you've seen it as the consultant looks at the site. He's calling, now the regulator is not necessarily involved, but you advise your client, well, you need to look here, you need to do this, and, you know, there's this we know you had pumps over here, and he says, no, look over here, or this and that, and, you know, no, don't go look there, all right? And we had a guest speaker a couple weeks ago who gave the example. He says, well, why not? That's the most logical place to look. He says, because that's where I buried it. Now, there's an ethical conundrum, all right? What are you supposed to do? There was a rule, I don't know, I have to double check because Dutch brought it up, a friend of mine. It used to be a rule that anyone with knowledge of an unpermitted release was required to report that to the state police and the Department of Environmental Quality within a certain time frame. When I tried to look that up years ago, it was removed from the statute. Dutch says it's in there. I have to double check that. But again, you're working for your client and he's paying your bills. Whose direction do you follow? It's a conundrum. And there are no easy answers and there's no absolute answers. You have to kind of follow your own moral compass on that.
Or you go through the seven
step by step. Yeah. Now, has anyone experienced anything like this? I'm not going to ask for names, but have you run across that? They tell you to, no, don't look there. Smirky face. All right, next one. This one happened to me. I was called in after all of the facts to help discover the environmental problem at this facility. So right down here on this building, a gentleman was mixing cleaning supplies, chemicals, wax, floor strippers, window cleaning stuff. Yes, there may have been hazardous materials. It was a fairly clean and well-run organization. And one day he got a knock on the door. And it was the EPA Criminal Investigation Division with a warrant for his arrest and a warrant to search his property. And that agency went and sampled in 3 locations. Now there was some type of the drainage through here, and then this was the street drainage out to here. And those gentlemen went to those 3 arrows and sampled it, and lo and behold, what do you think happened? It came back hot for exactly what they were told to look for. And so he got busted. Now, as a scientist, is that a significant sampling program to determine anything other than that whoever told us to look there knew it was there? When I got involved, we sampled.
And we all over, you did a grid, more or less?
Well, we did logical, basically we followed the drainage, because we said, how did it get here? And so we went back, because this is the loading dock and mixing area. How did, it had to originate from here and go somehow through the drainage to get here. And we could not make a connection. We could not make a connection. We put down a temporary monitoring well, there was no water impact. But the gentleman that ran the business was advised to plead guilty and pay the fine, because it was cheaper. Now, your stomach kind of tensing up on that one, which is what he did, and we, that was the end of my involvement in that. But this has always eaten at my stomach. It wasn't right. It just wasn't right. It turns out, after a year or two afterwards, I talked to him, and I don't know if he specifically found out or not, but he had just fired his chemist, who was the gentleman who was preparing those chemicals, doing the formulation stuff, and he found that he was selling those formulations on the side. So that gentleman was acting in a definitely unethical manner, and when he fired him, this is what the results was. Now, what do you do? It's an ethical conundrum. So, next one. A grade control geologist is the person that assays the ore coming out of production. And in this case, there were 3 shifts. There were 6 grade control geologists working different areas of the mine. This was an underground uranium mine. And at every heading that they took a shot, you would go in there, and it depends on when. I mean, if you could get there when they drilled it, but before they shot it, it was the best, because you had all these holes that went in 5 feet and all the cuttings came out. You could grab a grab sample and assay what they were going to shoot. That's probably the best case scenario. But even afterwards, they shot it, you could grab it, whatever, and get representative. And then you analyze that. So you have 3 shifts, 6 people, so that's 18, and maybe 5 headings, 6 headings for each shift. So what's that math? My gosh, that's a lot of samples for one day. Now it's 5 days a week, so multiply that by 5. So you get a weekly. And you can estimate the number of pounds of yellow cake you can derive from that ore. It's simple math. If it's a 5%, you're going to get 5 pounds out of, well, it was old 5, so you get 5 pounds out of a ton, I think it was, or half a ton. Whatever the numbers worked out. And so that was entered in the computer. Now this is in the early 80s, so if you can go back that far and imagine what Mac 2 or something like that, those real early ones.
Apple II.
Apple II.
IIc. I had one of those.
And we wrote the the bosses wrote the program. It's a simple spreadsheet, right? I mean, it just does the math. Enter the numbers, it does the math. So every week it was put in there, every month it was compiled, so you got a constant running. And then every so often, the ore pile, I mean, this is a huge pile of ore, was shipped down to the mill. Now, putting it in 25-ton dump trucks with a 10 cubic yard excavator, we went out there, and every bucket on that excavator we grabbed samples and ran the analysis. So it was mixed, it was homogenized, we sent it down to the mill. That was entered into the report. So then the mill processes it, and they kept it separate, so they knew just what was coming from the underground, because they had a surface mine too. So they knew how many pounds came out of the underground. And they gave us those numbers. And so, you put the spreadsheet together, you get the report from the mill, the computer says, at the end, do you like these numbers? And you have a choice. And if you don't like those numbers, it says, what numbers would you like? So if you punched in the mill numbers, you'd have a 0% error. You'd be dead spot on in your estimation of the ores. And so I didn't do any entering and whatnot, and I didn't know about this until I left. But our errors, and our performance was based on the error of our estimation. We only had 1 or 2% error, so we were spot on. Our job, we were doing it perfectly, no complaints.
But you didn't know why until you left, after you left.
So what would you do? It really didn't harm anybody because the actual empirical data was how many pounds of yellow cake we wound up with. And that's the bottom line in a business aspect. But as a scientific, I don't think that was ethical.
Well, and did it really not harm anybody? I mean, if there was any kind of projections, calculations, process control, quality control, planning that was done, assuming that those numbers were real, then it's harming that process.
It is, but in fact, that was a whole different program. And those numbers weren't really used in production, or in planning, I should say, in production. But that's a good question, because in some cases, that will be a business model that they would use that. The fact of production in that mine is based on market value. And so as the price of uranium went up, you could mine lower grade uranium. If the price fell, you had to upgrade your grade, and that caused engineering problems because now you're going after the sweet spots rather than just whatever you can grab. So
now, back to the sentient beings thing.
Okay.
So are you implying somehow that cats and dogs are different? No, monkeys. We know that monkeys, when they type, eventually will type Shakespeare's
Yeah, all of the
works. And
science.
here, the cat with its little milk there is typing the program.
The program. Look at what he got. My goodness gracious, that's pretty advanced if you ask me. And so here, this is another geologist's thing about ore. It's how you're taught to sample what's represented, what's a representative sample. So you can project what you're mining, where it's gonna go. And this is gold, so you take spot samples here, you have to know what the mineralization looks like. You don't wanna high grade it, because it's shiny gold, you don't wanna pick the gold necessarily. What are you gonna be mining? Are you able to mine a quartz vein that's 3 inches? Or are you gonna take this whole thing? And is this representative? Well, if you're gonna process that whole pile, that is probably more representative. If it's a random grab sample, it's more representative of everything you're gonna process. This is gonna be used to direct the miners where they need to mine. And I don't know if you could see this, but 0.8, 0.66, point whatever, 0.69, 0.56, whatever. That's a good question for the ASBOG test. What's the average grade of this sample? So here's one that you may have encountered. I received a phone call one day from a gentleman about a report that he had generated and sent into the DEQ about his property, and he wanted to know if it was okay to sell it. And I hadn't seen it, he just caught me as I picked up the phone. And he was very adamant that I give him an answer. I mean, he was adamant that I gave him an answer. So I found the report, and I had 2 samples that were high in PAHs and diesel. They failed recap. I said, dude, you're gonna have to send me a work plan to investigate your whole property if this is what you're saying is on the property. Oh, he blew up, and I got an earful, and the people next to me got it. the earful flow over from the telephone. I mean, they could hear him. And I said, look, I'm writing the letter right now, it's going out in the mail today. His attorney called the next day, and we had a meeting, and I said, I'll tell you what, I'll meet you out there, and we'll go over the site, whatnot. So we met up with the consultant who was out there, and I said, so where did you sample? Okay, folks, I'm gonna pass this around. Tell me where they sampled. It's the green button. Where did they sample? Oh, my goodness, yeah. And how did that telephone pole get put in the ground? Oh, with an old leaky diesel rig, right? Now, my God, none of you would do that. You know better than that, right? Or, if you knew the regulator wasn't gonna go out there, it's a good way to generate new business, right?
We've seen.
So I went out, I saw that, and I said, no, we're gonna go over there, and we're gonna go down here and take samples. Now, I was doing my duty, probably a little bit above and beyond what would normally be expected, but it was only fair and ethical that, you follow up on these questionable numbers.
Before you go on, because you have a drill rig there, ethics and training. Training is part of ethics, training yourself and training others. Once upon a time in another state, there was a drill rig like that.
It's in the next slide.
Is it in the next slide?
I think it is. Right?
Well, that's a different story.
Okay.
This one here, I was going to mention because it's a question to you guys. Drill rig came to the location, brand new project manager, their first project. They have their map and everything. They go into the building of whatever this facility is where they're going to drill. They walk in, there's a receptionist, is the only person there. They ask the receptionist, is it okay to drill? Yes, sure. They drilled 5 wells at the wrong site. So now, how do you distribute the blame there? I mean, do you just put all the blame on the project manager? You certainly can't put all the blame on the receptionist. What about training? What about whoever sent this brand new project manager out there without making sure that they really knew where the location was? So huge consequences, obviously. And then the next one, and what happens if they found something? That's the question for the regulator, yes.
Yeah, what happened? Well, that goes back to if you have knowledge of an unpermitted release, you have to notify them.
Where there was not supposed to be any drilling there.
And they had no permit, they had no warrant.
Yeah.
Basically, I don't know if the lawyers would say it's the fruit of a poison tree. Can't use it in evidence. I don't know. That's an attorney.
Right. All right, and then the next one. Driller dumps drilling spoils into a hole in the ground. Well, this is a real story. I asked a friend of mine if he had anything he could contribute, any idea as an example for this year. And instantly he remembered the driller who told him, oh, don't worry, Joe. No muss, no fuss. They were putting the drill spoils into a hole in the ground, and it was gone, but of course it wasn't right. So this here is a picture of a directional drilling.
Horizontal well, directional.
That's the drill pit, that's the directional drill going in, and so the drill pit generates a lot of fluid. So you have illegal dumping. This one here is just dumping it into a field somewhere. That, of course, is the way you're supposed to do it if you have a lot of drill spoils. But no muss, no fuss.
I'm going to ask you guys, under the drilling laws, under your driller's license, what do you do with uncontaminated drill cuttings? What can you do with it? What has to be done with it? Nobody knows? You gotta know. Come on.
We containerize everything. There's no, in our situation, there's no room for, because someone could construe it as a waste. So we take no chances, and everything's containerized.
Because you don't know for sure.
That's a good business principle. But in
That
reality,
is
the
one that would,
laws.
certainly it would pass through the ethics screening.
That's right. That's how
But
we
if
do it.
it's a water well and it's uncontaminated, you can dispose of that on the surface of the ground. You say, can I dump it here? And it's perfectly legal to spread the drilling mud and the cuttings wherever.
In your opinion, yes.
Yeah.
But there's gonna be a contrary opinion that says it's contaminated.
Well, right.
Especially when you're drilling it and you don't know yet.
That's right.
See, that's exactly the point. Exactly. If you don't know, don't take the chance. Next. So this is a friend of mine. This really happened. This gentleman was the geologist, hydrogeologist for a firm, and he'd been studying this plant. I mean, he was the plant. He was with the plant, and he had the hydro all years and years and years. He knew the back and forward, up and down, in and out.
You mean of the site?
Of the plant,
Of
of
the
his
facility,
plant, his
okay.
plant. He worked at the plant. And one day, he had a new boss, and the boss said, Fred, who was an intern or a very young engineer, not a geologist, not a hydrologist, hydrogeologist, new to the plant. The boss said, take John's report, rewrite it up a little bit, make it easier to read, and we're gonna send it up to corporate. And Fred did, and he asked, should he put his name on it? And he said, yeah, go ahead, but you just send it on. Don't ask John about the accuracy or if you got it right, or, just send it on up the line. Well, it went on up the line, so the boss's boss got it. What is this? This isn't what we've been seeing. Why is it wrong and incomplete? Who wrote it? What's going into this? So the second level boss says, don't worry, I'll take care of it. Send it off to legal. Said, we need an investigation on the facts and how this report got. Well, you know how the report got written or rewritten. HR sent it to the lawyers. The lawyers interviewed all of the people. They looked into his qualifications. Are you licensed? How long have you done this? What's your education? I mean, they grilled this guy. He's been doing this for 20, 30 years. When I wrote this, I didn't get the back end or the final end of the story. So they investigated him. They investigated John, and naturally the names have been changed to protect the innocent. And he called me up. He says, Bill, what should I do? What can I do? I says, well, it's plagiarism if he didn't give you credit. That's one thing. And he's got a license or is getting a license, so I think I would be pushing those kind of ethical misconduct. Not to mention your boss, because there are corporate ethics involved here too. Well, as it turned out, the lawyers investigated and they found out, for a change, they found out the truth. He was exonerated and his boss wasn't. I don't know the final consequences, but doesn't report to that boss anymore. So his name was cleared. Things worked finally. And this was another, just a little tidbit, when I was a TA at USL, I correct myself, I gave extra credit if a student would write a report on anything in geology that they wanted to look up. I said 3 pages, 3 references. That's not a big thing, So I get this 25, 30 page typewritten report, beautiful diagrams and all of this stuff. Now, it turned out this was a foreign student. English was his second language. You can read scientific reports and tell right away if the person was really good in English or not. And the terminology was a little bit off, and the data was a little bit off. And I said, geez, this just doesn't fit right. I went to the library and I found the exact report that was published and put into the library. And this gentleman in 36, no less, and he spent the time or paid to have it retyped and turned in as his own work. Now here's the question to the group here. I'm sure you all understand this was flat out plagiarism and it's totally unethical. But because it was an extra credit thing and it wasn't coursework required, what do? I just didn't give them the extra credit. Now, this has absolutely nothing to do with the Corps of Engineers. I just needed a picture. But this happened to me. Just after I had surgery, no less. But this consultant put together a work plan that was totally crap. And the consultant, well, she was the consultant, and the company was trying to sell this property. And I said, no, this doesn't fit with recap, it doesn't do that. Well, what changes should I make? He says, I'm not writing your work plan. I says, look it up, do your job, you're getting paid for this. Went through a second round and it was still a piece of crap. I went to the owner and I said, look, I just got out of the hospital. I can't be doing this. I'm on part-time as it is. And it's not working. This is not good. I said, you really either need to talk to this person or, do something. Well, this person disappeared. Took the retainer, never finished the work, never saw her again. And then I had to go and work with the next consultant, because there was a time frame. And yeah, we got the thing together and got it closed out, but took the money and ran. I'd never seen it before. I've had all of these but the car.
Still waiting.
Still waiting on the car. And in the business world,
He's already chosen it, by the way.
is that a Lamborghini? Does anybody know?
Here's Corvette.
That's a Corvette? Anyway, as a state employee, I had to turn it all down, but in today's world, in the business world, it's just a business perk for some people. So this is the last one. When I was working at the mine, my job was to tell what's ore and what's waste. You need to mine here. You can't mine there because that's waste. That costs money that we're not going to recover. So the mine bosses, the two crew bosses, were in the change room, shower room, and they were over here and I was back over here, and unbeknownst to them, the mine manager was back in here. All right, and so this may be edited out, but they used a derogatory term for us grade control geologists. They call us pebble pimps. And I'm okay with that. Okay, I could take a joke, right? Until it gets in your face personal. And these guys over here, they're changing and showering and all this stuff, and I was too, and such as, and they started dissing us guys. We're the miners, we'll take whatever we want, we'll go whatever we want. It's easier to go get, 10 tons over here and make our quota of tonnage. Yeah, I said, well, you do know that it was waste. They were on me, and I didn't say that. Well, that was waste. I told you it was waste. She says, I don't care, we got our tonnage. So the guy over here is looking at me, and he does that. He says, go on, let them cut their throat, give them some more rope. And so we did, and then I quit.
I was wondering, what's the punchline?
The punchline. I had to get out of there. This was the same one with the computer program. It was just not conducive to being ethical in your profession. Yeah, they got chewed out, they didn't get fired, but I couldn't work for them anymore. You have to have mutual respect, and that's when it gets lost, isn't it? So that's the whole ball of wax. We've got other examples that we can develop, but if you guys have any kind of, and again, we didn't use names or point out to whom or what, but if you have examples, let me know, put a little something together, and we'll go from there. But if you have any questions or comments, now's the time to throw it up here. This is all of the folks that we get our information from.
We get our information from a Pelican?
Yeah, that's engineering board. Gotta recognize them because they get credit for this too. So, and that's our contact information, so. Thanks for your attention, and please, if you have comments or requests.
Questions?